Hey there! It's been a little while since our last update, our last video update, so I'm here to change that. We are basically waiting around for a couple of weeks. It is currently Chinese New Year, so there is a gap while we are waiting for our proofs to arrive from our manufacturer. We're really excited about this. These proofs are going to be really fun to show off when they get here. But we won't have them for a little while, and until they're here, we can't really do anything with the game. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about naming conventions in this game, how to come up with good names, and why so many things in my game are hard to pronounce Greek words. So first off, let's talk about where some of these ideas come from. So much of this game is rooted in real-world science, but fundamentally the game is a science fiction game. Because of that, I wanted to use as many real words as possible. In the game, there's very few words that are made up. Almost all of the words in the game come from either science or mythology. They come from actual languages, whether they're dead or not. The first complex words people are going to come into contact with in this game is Absinthos and Absinthian. Absinthos is the ship that brought people here, and Absinthian is the planet that they are on. Absinthos is a real word. It means absinthe. Obviously, it's a very similar sounding word. It also means wormwood. Hence the name in the title and everything else we've talked about in previous videos. Absinthian is not a real word. It roughly means planet of wormwood, but it doesn't actually mean anything. That's one of the only made-up words in the game that's this compound sort of smashed together Greek root structure that forms the idea of this planet. Everything else is based on real things. So you'll come into contact with the Myrmidon Dominion. The Myrmidons are based on Achilles' Myrmidon band. So this is an old Greek Iliad thing. You can look up that if you're not familiar with the Odyssey or the Iliad. But normally, military groups tend to name themselves after very old things. And they tend to, right now, draw from Greek and Latin, like Roman and Spartan ideas, because those were the legions that we sort of modeled our militaries after. So that's why this is called the Myrmidon Dominion. There are no Myrmidons, as far as I know, in modern military jargon, which is why I can use it without causally referencing any current military structure, which I don't want to do. You'll also see the Coriolan Exiles and the Red Hegemony. All right, so let's talk about each one of these in order. The Coriolan Exiles, they come from the city of Corioli. Lots of people, when they first encounter that, they'll pronounce it Coriolis, like the wind thing. It's not Coriolis, it's Corioli. Corioli was an old city, but the city is no longer called Coriolis. It was a long time ago in testing, but when we found out that Corioli is a real city, it makes a lot more sense. The reason it was called Coriolis, and later on Corioli, is because the idea was that the city resided inside of a massive, endless, spiraling sandstorm that never really stopped and acted as a barrier between it and the outside world. That's no longer the case. The endless wind doesn't really happen anymore. It's just sort of a shortcut to say that these are the areas that have large storms. But the name stuck, and we ended up sticking with Corioli because it sounded really good and matched what we were going for with the old Greek and Latin ideas for naming cities and the planet itself. The Red Hegemony. I've been pronouncing this hegemony for a long time, and then when we were testing one day, somebody pronounced it hegemony, and I looked it up, and I was completely wrong. There's a lot of these words that I had written down and had read and written for years and never thought to look up how to pronounce them, and was just sort of pronouncing them the way I thought they were pronounced. And the most natural way is not usually the way in English. So this is hegemony. The next most mispronounced word, I think, in the game is probably the Calliope. This is a drone state card. The Calliope is based on it's like a rocket launcher that attaches to a tank. This was in World War II, where I believe a Sherman tank, don't quote me on that, had a rocket launcher mounted to it, and the rocket launcher looks an awful lot like a pipe organ. And a Calliope, at some point in the past, was referring to a pipe organ that was inside of like a cart drawn by horses, and people would ride it through town during like fairs and stuff and just pipe crazy music as they went. I guess now it would be the equivalent of like an ice cream truck, but it doesn't sell ice cream. It just makes a horrible sound and looks crazy. That's what a calliope is. It's basically a mobile rocket launcher. So if you read the card, it says it's slow and deals splash. And there's no more room to explain why. That's why it's slow and deals splash. It's a massive mobile anti-grav rocket launcher that essentially just acts as a big spinning rocket platform that is easy to blow up, but also can launch things really far away. That is based on a word from American Army nomenclature. So calliope is the word, and that is how to pronounce that. Next up, what is the next most difficult word? Definitely this one, which right before the video started, this is the anemoy. Am I correct about that? Did I just say that right?
I think anemoy.
Oh, no.
Right? Anemoy?
Anemoy. This is a word that I had to look up just a few seconds ago and before starting the video because I realized I had never actually said this one out loud. This is a Windwalker card, anemoy. I cannot believe that I never actually checked on that. I was pronouncing it anemoy. It's anemoy. Anemoy is a Greek mythology. There's an anemoy for each wind. So like each wind has its own like spirit or like demigod idea that governs the wind. The Windwalkers, just like the Coriolans, live in an environment that is extremely wind buffeted. They're constantly having to resist like massive storm fronts that whip up sandstorms and pull in the ships from the atmosphere. The idea of the anemoy is that they would have been named that a long, long, long time ago when they were still using a lot of Greek roots during the Windwalkers' expedition out into the wastes, and the anemoy name stuck, even though the people started to change over time and weren't like a scientific band of people just going into storm fronts. Not anemoi. I like anemoi more. It sounds kind of like anemone, but I am completely wrong. That one's anemoy. So there you go. What's next? Here's a good example. This is the Lilin Matron. This is another Windwalker card. Lilin Matron has a bunch of things on it that we need to talk about a little bit. So the first off, this is a Xeno unit, and if you know Greek roots, then you're going to immediately flag this as being like, well, that's clearly wrong. This should be Xenos with an S at the end because it's singular. It's one Lilin Matron, and Xeno is plural. So why is that? Well, there's multiple reasons. Number one, science fiction problems. The word Xeno is used now in a bunch of science fiction properties, particularly things like Alien and Warhammer, which uses Xenos correctly. And because of that, it started to like filter into sort of generalized speech. The thing is that if it did, let's say, for example, in the future, if the word Xenos filtered into English, it would lose the S because S in English is plural, right? So if we assume that we need a word for an alien that is not an alien because it lives with us, then you end up with the word Xeno, not Xenos. Which is far more natural to say. And that's how that works. I considered a long time trying to add the S, and it makes no sense. In English, that does not work. You cannot just add S's to things and expect them to function. This is also how we have problems with words like moose and octopi, things that have serious issues with trying to cram S's onto them to try and create plural versions of these things. Lots of animal words have these issues, and this is no different. So it is, in the end, Xeno. This is also a Lilin. Lilin are one of the xenofauna on Absinthian. They just so happen to be sapient, so they are Stone Age-ish level. Lilin, I believe, is Greek. It is from the Torah. The Lilin are the children of Lilith. So Lilith was Adam's first wife in the Torah. There's a whole story I'm not going to go into about why she gets kicked out and ends up wandering in the wilderness. But Lilith has children that become the Lilin, which are these, like, sometimes they're giants, sometimes they're monsters, depending on what story you're looking at. The Lilin are just an alternate form, basically, of humanity. So there's basically a split there between where humanity starts. One branch becomes humans, and then one branch becomes Lilin. And that's why they're called the Lilin, is the idea that, well, this is the first other sapient species we've encountered that has things like language and music and just kind of human-like cultures, even though they also have very very inhuman things as well. They end up being called the Lilin because they are the first contact species that we have with another sapient culture. We got fly strikers. A lot of people questioned fly strikers recently on the Discord. There were a couple of questions about what fly strikers are and what that actually means. So fly strike is what happens when a domesticated animal, usually sheep, because they are really broken. Take a sheep, they're just not okay. When a domesticated animal gets like a fly larva embedded in its body, that's fly strike. So flies will take advantage of the fact that like domesticated animals' bodies are not particularly well constructed, and you can end up with like an infestation of flies inside of an animal. That's the idea of what's happening in fly strike. They have a nanite infestation basically in the body that is being used as a military weapon, that they'll like explode if hit. That's the fly strikers. It's not a random word. It is specific to what the card does and the description of the card and everything else. That's what fly strike is if you haven't encountered farming terminology before. Another good word, let's talk about the lotus eaters. This is not a pronunciation problem, but if you're not familiar with the Odyssey, check it out. The lotus eaters is referring to a specific scene in the Odyssey when the crew of the Odyssey ends up encountering people who eat lotus leaves and are using it as an intoxicant. The lotus eaters are part of the Myrmidon bands. Lotus eaters does refer to the addiction in these specific units. So if you actually read the description, most of them talk about the war hymn being this audio drug. The lotus eaters specifically talk about the stims that they also take along with that. So these are like double addicts that are taking two different, well, one substance and one sound to make them like driven into a war fury. So that's lotus eaters. That's also why they have 0 armor. They have no protective instincts at all. What else we got? The Shrike Herd. For those of you who haven't either read Hyperion or know your biology, a shrike is a bird, a really pretty bird, that lives in really spiky plants. And it grabs animals like mice and lizards and other things that are small and impales them on the spikes of thorny thistle plants or like trees with thorns. It's really fascinating that this thing operates in this very specific way. This very specific bird is the only one that's using this tree or plant or thistle as a tool. It both kill its prey and also hold it for later, because it'll like leave, come back, and bring more. So we might have like a little tree full of dead animals as a result of shrikes. I call these guys shrikes simply because they look really gentle. The picture looks really gentle, and I loved the idea that just like the bird, this really gentle animal has a really dark side as well. That they are threatening, but in a really unusual way. And it never shows what the shrike does. You just see them in the fog, like every other Machina thing, every robot out in the mist. You see them out in the mist, you don't know exactly what they are, but like everything else, they're named in such a disturbing way that you know they do something terrible, right? You just don't know what, because it doesn't say exactly what they do, and I like that a lot. The Nautilus. Nautilus is based on the animal, the Nautilus, which is, it's not a squid and it's not an octopus, but it's somewhere in between. It lives in a shell. It is extremely well armored, extraordinarily protected, to the point where they're one of the like oldest animals that still exist. They'd have never had to evolve because they are so well protected from attack. So the Nautilus, this thing right here, the idea I had was that it would roll into a ball. So like it would, just like a Nautilus hides in its shell, the Nautilus Machina would roll into a ball and then exert this field. So it's like double protected. It has physical armor, and then it also has this energy field that it projects around it when it rolls into a ball. And that's the idea behind the Nautilus, is the idea that it units adjacent to it get +1 armor. It projects a field around it once it rolls into a ball and has its own little armor set on its own. So I like Nautilus a lot. I thought that was this is honestly one of my favorite cards. I love Nautilus. Okay, some rapid fire random word things. The Iron Oni. Oni is like a Japanese demon, mostly referred to from the 18th century. There's nothing really to that. The Harlequin, the complex thing about the Harlequin isn't so much the name Harlequin. You can kind of guess that's like colorful clown, basically, a French clown. But chromatophores. If you don't know what chromatophores are like the skin of a cuttlefish or an octopus. Chromatophores are these basically pigmentation things in their skin that can be altered to change the reflectivity of light. So by altering chromatophores, you can very, very rapidly change your color. You can change your texture, sort of. You can change how you're communicating with something to your left or your right. Chromatophores do a lot and allow for a lot of communication without sound. Most animals on Absinthian don't make a lot of sound. Their atmosphere is really thick and really violent. And so as a result of the constant storm front, it makes sense that they wouldn't use a lot of vocalization, but they would use a lot of subsonic frequencies and then chromatophoric reactions. And some of the descriptions you see of Lilin definitely describe their chromatophoric wings, even though that has nothing to do with the game as it's designed. The only time you actually see chromatophores used in the game are with Harlequins. You can see that they have cloak because they can change their color and their form and their iridescence at any time. So why do I name things after real words, even if the words are really hard or in a different language or something else? I think it's really important for plausibility and to act as almost like your brain's shortcut for acknowledging this as a potential real world, right? I wouldn't say it's definitely not hard science fiction. There's weird teleportation and things in the game. It's not really hard science fiction, but I wanted the world to feel as close to an analog as our real world as possible. And that's why I draw from biology and history to both give you a jumping off point to figure out why these cards are what they are. There's only so much room on the card, so giving it an odd name that can be easily researched gives you a way to find out maybe more about what I was thinking about when I created the card without having to cram it into the tiny little space at the bottom for the flavor text. But I also really want it to be very clear that this world has a very long history and that history originates on Earth. And this isn't some alternate reality. It's not Star Wars. It's very much based in the possible extrapolation of what humanity would do in its future forms or in an alternate geography, basically. People don't really make up words. They combine words, and words alter and change as languages change, which is how we end up with things like Xeno and Xenos, things like that. If you look at Middle English 800 years ago was basically unintelligible to what we hear right now. It's still English. You can kind of grasp what it is if it's explained to you by a linguist. You're like, oh, I can see how that's English, or I can see how that's even the same word as what I'm saying, just pronounced in sort of a roundabout way or written in a completely different way. A good example of this is goodbye. This is a wild one. Goodbye, a very old word, it actually means God be with you. So it's not just a contraction, it's like an acronym. And then you end up over a long period of time ending up with something that says goodbye sounds like, oh yeah, no, that you would logic out. That makes a logical sense why you would say goodbye as someone is leaving. But that isn't at all what that word originates with. But even then, they didn't make up the word. It was still part of a much older phrase that's being born out of these Germanic languages. So languages change over time, they alter, but most of the sounds were created thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. That's what happens here. And I imagine that certainly these people are no longer speaking a form of English that you would ever understand. Same thing with biology. I wanted to be as accurate as possible with these biological terms. So when you see terms like drone, they mean a lot of simultaneous things. It's a very specific idea of what a drone is with both bees and wasps and ants. When we refer to drones, we refer to them in a somewhat similar way, which is like a human being who works all the time and can't see outside of their own sort of sector of occupation. I really like games that teach me something. I really enjoy when I play a game and I come away from the game and I feel like I learned something, like my brain got a little bigger on the way out. I love that. And it doesn't have to be a lot, it's just a little bit. Just, I learned a fact from this board game, right? I really enjoy that. And so I kind of sprinkle that into each faction where it's just, okay, I've encountered a word I don't know, or like a term that seems like I can kind of work it out, but I've never seen it before or used in this way. Then you could go and research that a little bit and check out Wikipedia and be like, oh, okay, this is like, there's much deeper terminology here. There's much more going on than just the surface. There's like a reason this is named the way it is, and explains more about this world, or explains more about this character, about this mech, whatever. You can understand more about your history than the history of the world around you, and then extrapolate that into the history of a world that doesn't exist. So that is just a tiny handful of cards in the game, just some I picked out and thought were like interesting to talk about their titles. If you have seen any cards that you want me to go over and talk about like how they were made, because each individual card usually has a story behind like how it was made, how it was remade, and how it was tested, I'm happy to go over that on a video and talk about another handful of cards and what they mean and why they exist. As soon as the factory prototype is in our hands, we will make a video the next day showing off the finalized or almost finalized components, so you can see them in detail and what we've created finally, because we're still working off of like a 2-month-old prototype and just waiting for this thing to cross the ocean. So just hold on. I'm very excited for being able to see it myself, because I have never seen the final proof for a lot of these. We'll do a detailed unboxing for our own game when it gets here.